We're back on Night School, and here we go. I can't help it. When I hear his voice, when I think about his voice coming through my transistor radio from Winnipeg, from Edmonton, late nights as a kid growing up in Manchester, Connecticut, Bob Neumeier, the voice of the New England and then later Hartford Whalers, and Brass Bonanza plays him in. Good evening,
Steve.
Bob.
Brass Bonanza, the song that will never go away.
It will never go away, and it rings in the ears of Whaler fans. And I don't know if I ever told you my years at Colgate. You know, Terry Slater, who, of course, had coached the Cincinnati Stingers, he co-opted it. And at Colgate, he would have we would play Brass Bonanza after Colgate goals.
I mean, what's more popular? I Left My Heart in San Francisco or Brass Bonanza? Let's face it.
Well, in our hearts, Whaler fans, it's a song that really brings back a great era. And, of course, your voice as just identifiable as the great logo of the Whalers. And, Bob, we turn to the action at hand when it comes to the Breeders' Cup and, of course, the NBC coverage looming. And tomorrow we will have our pre-entered fields for the Breeders' Cup 2014.
Yeah, this is an exciting time for handicappers everywhere. You know, there's like a three-ply process. You know, you get the pre-entries, and then you kind of pour through, you know, the starting phase of it, and then you get the draw, and then you kind of change your mind because of the post positions, and then, you know, you get all the workout reports, and you change your mind a third time, and, you know, by the time the day rolls around, it's paralysis by analysis. So it's an interesting process, but I think that horse players everywhere really love it because you really get to sink your teeth into comparing horses from not just North America but Europe as well, how they stack up, and it's a terrific event. I remember I was telling my wife today, and it's just funny that I remember when the original concept was announced by NBC, I was able to get an audience with Michael Weissman, who is the executive producer of NBC, and nobody knew who I was. I was a TV guy working in Boston who loved racing and whatever, and sent him a couple of tapes of a few features that I did and all that stuff. And he gave me an hour of his time. I didn't get the job, but I drove down from Boston to New York, and but yet that first year, I remember going to Hollywood Park with three friends of mine. I was watching Bruff Scott and Pete Axthelm and Harvey Pack do their warm-up for the rehearsal for the first show. And I told my friends that someday I'm going to do that. And in 1990, I got hired by NBC to do the Breeders' Cup. And, you know, we lost it for a while there, but I've done it now since 1990. And, I mean, how lucky have I been that, you know, given, I'll never forget that fateful day at Hollywood Park where I just said, I'm going to somehow, some way, by hook or crook, I'm going to be on that telecast. And it's, boy, what a dream come true.
Well, and breaking in 1990, certainly a difficult day in terms of Breeders' Cup history, and I was certainly there that day, and that one was a little rough.
Yeah, that's the Go for Wand experience, which I remember one of the interviews that hit home was with Ron McAnally that I did. You know, that it was the world's largest funeral home. I mean, I remember even hard-bitten people like Angel Cordero just, you know, moved to tears. And that was, of course, the great race with Bayacoa, and to see that horse break down right in front of the grandstand, gut-wrenching, no doubt about it. Still remains a tough way to break in, but maybe in some ways a hardened way to break in. And I'll never forget that interview I did with Mr. McAnally that day.
Well, and even to start the day in the sprint with Mr. Nickerson having the equine heart incident and collapsing and Shaker Knit going over him, and the day started rough, and you figured, all right, that's as bad as it's going to get, and it went from bad to worse. And Dick Enberg was the host that time, and
Dick liked racing, but I think he was obviously known for football and baseball and just a top class professional in every way. She liked the event. And he had he had Tom Hammond was there obviously, and he did an unbelievable job of kind of bringing it back to and try to create the fact that it was still an exciting event, and rather than just it was all doom and gloom. He did an unbelievable job of trying to relive the Breeders' Cup atmosphere, even in the wake of the tragedies that occurred. And I'll never forget that. And every time I see Dick, I always say, I'll never forget that day, 1990, because it was a thrill for me to meet Dick Enberg, let alone work with him, and that he was able to carry on and create an atmosphere that was still conducive to interest in racing and all that stuff, which is tough to do after something like that happens, no doubt about it. He did a great job.
Well, the action in terms of determining what kind of fields we're looking at and discerning the trends and how horses are coming into the Breeders' Cup. We're talking key races in this particular session, Bob, and we introduced the conversation with Caton Bradar and Jeremy. And when you sit down and try to evaluate going in and getting a storyline for a race and then the handicapping portion, how are you creating that pecking order and intertwining the quality of the fields that the horses came from, given the disparity and given the far-flung nature of the contenders that come together in Breeders' Cup races?
So we're talking about handicapping the Breeders' Cup races, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am I'm an analytical guy, and I'm a slave to the numbers because I think the numbers tell a lot about the quality of the racehorse, and we can debate which is the best speed figure group that's out there. Do you rely on Bayard? Do you rely on Ragozin? Do you rely on Jerry Brown? Do you rely on Briss? Whatever. But I personally think I don't go by the eyeball test because the eyeball test can fool you. So what I like to do is get a feel for, and I particularly use the Ragozin sheets, and I basically know, given the last 5 or 6 years of Breeders' Cup races, what it takes, what number does it take to win these races. Sometimes it fools you. The Juvenile is a great example, and I know the Lasix, was part of that whole argument. The Lasix, the non-Lasix, whatever. But I basically know what it takes to win the Classic. I basically know what it takes to win the Mile, and other races as well. And so basically, I have in my head, I might be able to whittle down a field of 12 or 14 to maybe 4 or 5 that I think can run that number or have run that number or in a position to run that number. And that's a key for me. So I'll toss out, maybe 60 to 70% of the field based on the fact that I don't think they can run that number to win this race. Now, I'll be fooled sometimes, but it's a pretty good measuring stick for where to go. So that's how basically I start. And once tomorrow rolls around and once the pre-entries are announced, I already know because I have a chart in front of me that tells me what the numbers of filly and mare turf for the last 5 years, what it takes to win that race. I'll go back and I'll look and see, does Stephanie's Kitten fit that bill, for example? Maybe yes, maybe no. If she does, she's in the mix. Then I'll look at the post position. Then I'll look at the pace. Then I'll look at the possible odds. And that's basically how I go about it, Steve, is that I just basically use those numbers and use what I think it takes to win that race and go from there.
In terms of folding in the quality of each of the races, for instance, we look at the Classic, and you're going to take, let's say, the Awesome Again and the Pacific Classic, the Jockey Club Gold Cup, the Travers, the Homecoming Classic at Churchill with Cigar Street. And in terms of looking at the relative strength of those fields, does that, in terms of a key race philosophy, how much of that will be folded into your, to your decision making?
I think it's very subjective, and I think that those who play the races on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, people talk about what are key races. Well, the normal definition is 6 weeks after the fact, you back and say, you look at well, there were 3 winners that emerged from the second at Calder on such and such a date, and that horse shows up, and you say, well, that's a key race. Okay, I get it. I look at it differently. I look at it and say, I'm approaching tomorrow's Belmont second race, for example, and whatever it might be a $16,000 claimer, and I'll do the numbers and I'll say, wow, there's 10 horses in that race, and 8 of them have run par or better for that particular classification. That, to me, is a key race. There are times when there could be a $20,000 claimer with 10 horses entered. When one of the 10 horses has run that par number, that's a negative race to me. So that's how I view key races, Steve, is that I look at the strength of the field versus the pars that given class can run. So, I'm looking back now at some of these races now, and it's very difficult. I'll go back and I'll say, well, I found that the numbers in the Derby were off, for example. And it's interesting that not a lot of Derby horses have really stamped themselves. The second place finisher has gone nowhere. So maybe that's, going in, I looked at it and I said, these numbers for 3-year-olds going into the Derby, they're slow, relatively speaking, from past years. Hence, I wasn't a big California Chrome guy moving forward. He ran a terrific number in the Preakness. That was a Triple Crown winning number. So, I put a little stock in that race. So basically, that's how I go about it. And again, it's plugged into the numbers and how they fit. So I'm a slave to the numbers. I hate to say it, but that's how I've done it. I've had some moderate success with it, so I'm not going to change now for sure.
In terms of the areas that are a little murkier, particularly the juveniles, because with Caton, that was the first area I brought up, the first division. The juveniles are a group of horses that very often somebody can jump forward, but it also has been a fairly straightforward, particularly the main track version of the juvenile races. And these days, it's gotten so that by the time we get to Breeders' Cup, so many of these juveniles are making maybe a third career start. It seems like an area where comparing the relative strength of the races that they've exited and the kinds of fields they've faced, and not just in races like the Front Runner and the Champagne and the Del Mar Futurity, but even in their maiden races, it would seem like a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, well, that's the difficulty in the whole thing. Not just 2-year-old races, but 3-year-old races as well. Which is why when you do the numbers, to me, the most reliable are turf races, particularly older horses on the turf. They are what they are. They don't seem to vary all that much. 3-year-olds can make quantum leaps. 2-year-olds particularly can make huge leaps, which is why, playing those races is dicey. Now, a perfect example is, we have 3 2-year-olds that just jump off the page numbers-wise. American Pharaoh is one. Carpe Diem is another. That other bomb of Pletcher, what's his name? It escapes me. Daredevil is another one. He rode, he put up an 8-point jump from his first race to his second race. He may match it. He may go back. And so you don't really know, but that Daredevil and Carpe Diem and American Pharaoh look light years ahead of anything else that's in that field. But, hey, that doesn't mean that some other horse can't jump up and do the same thing that Carpe Diem did or that American Pharaoh did. And that's the mystery of the whole thing. We can argue about bounces, we can argue about this, we can argue about that. But at least I know in my heart that these 3 2-year-olds are outstanding in comparing them to past years. The figure for New Year's Day was awful last year. The figure for Shanghai Bobby was awful 2 years ago. Hansen, he ran pretty fast. Uncle Mo, lights out. Typically, you don't see those horses as 3-year-olds. It's amazing that the faster they run as 2-year-olds, the less chance they get to the gate at Churchill Downs the first Saturday in May. Kind of counterintuitive, but that's kind of the way it works out. But again, I can only go by my faith that the numbers will keep me in the ballpark somewhere along the line. But yeah, his 2-year-olds throw the darts, and who knows?
Jeremy.
Bob brings up a lot of great points there, and Neumeier, thanks for joining us. It's good to have you on here. You talk about how the numbers can put horses in a clump for you. Look, this clump of horses are capable of running. Then it becomes your job as a horse player to say, I've got 3 or 4 left, and how do I separate them? And this is where some of these things like a key race, like a jockey change, an equipment change, these are some of the separator kind of things that can start separating horses of likability. So when you start to look at, let's take those horses you're talking about, for example, for the Breeders' Cup, American Pharoah winning the front runner, and you've got, the horses from New York, Carpe Diem via Kentucky, and Daredevil straight from New York. For fans out there, these 3 horses have never matched up with each other, so we don't know how they go head-to-head. My challenge to you between now and Breeders' Cup time is to go back, look at the charts for those races that those horses ran against, and see who else were in the race. Do a little research, see what you might find in there. One thing about good horses and 2-year-olds, a lot of them are going to kind of identify themselves by the tote board and by the trainers. We know who wins the 2-year-old races. Let's just say, for example, I haven't done it yet, but let's go back to Daredevil's career debut at Belmont. I'm looking at the past performances. He wins September 13th by 6 1/4 lengths. That looks great. There's a horse running second named Bowtie Boss, who I have no idea who that is, and a horse named Because I'm Happy, who I'm not familiar with. My job as a horse player now is to go find out who Bowtie Boss is and who Because I'm Happy is. Do a horse search, go on Formulator, go back, see if these horses have run again, go to Equibase.com and do the horse search, see if they've run again. Maybe these horses came back to run 7th next time out and did absolutely nothing while well bet. Maybe they're horses from no-name barns. Chances are, if you have horses from no-name barns in 2-year-old races that are running high up on the board, it wasn't a very deep 2-year-old race. I mean, we know the guys who typically and the gals who typically are going to run 1, 2, 3, 4 in a lot of these races. They'll have 6 or 8 of the entries between the power barns and the 2-year-old races. If you're watching a Keeneland 2-year-old race and there's not Asmussen, Ward, McPeak, the kind of Pletcher, the kind of guys you're expecting to see in the top 4, chances are that probably wasn't one of the stronger 2-year-old races of the meet. That's what you've got to do with some of these horses to separate now.
Well, I mean, that sounds easy, but I mean, I don't know that horse A beats horse B and horse B beats horse C, that horse A will beat horse C. It's like football. I mean, the Rams beat the Seahawks, and the Seahawks beat so-and-so, therefore the Rams will beat. I mean, I know people gravitate towards that. It's simplistic. I mean, I hear commentators and pundits use this all the time. They say, well, I don't like this horse because the horse that beat him ran out in the allowance known as a 1. But in what context did he run out? Did he get in trouble? Was he facing a better field? Did he have a lousy post? Did his jockey glom him? I mean, so these simplistic kind of ways of looking at it and saying, well, I'm going to look at, I love this because X horse graduated out of this race. Now, having said that, I had a nice winner at Keeneland on Sunday. And one of the rare times where I actually used the so-called key race, this was a turf race of Charlie Lopresti. I forget the name of the horse. But I wound up, Jeremy, doing exactly that, and I found out that the horses that he was running against had 2 of them, in fact, wound up stakes placed or won a stakes. And this was a maiden race in kind of a blank field. So there was a good example, Jeremy, of a case where this horse, I forget the name, but he paid 5 or 6 to 1, and he won very handsomely. I was right for once. Actually came out of a similar situation that you're talking about. But I think by and large that it's dangerous to just look at one horse that didn't run well, and so it was a lousy. I hear that all the time. It was a lousy race because this horse didn't win, or it's a great race because this horse did win. I mean, I think that you have to put it in context for sure.
Shift Colors, the horse you're talking about on the 6th race on Keeneland over the weekend. If people want to go back,
if you go back and look at his running lines in his races, you'll see there were a couple of turf horses that either won a stakes or came close. So that was a tip off there that this horse looked pretty well meant, and he paid a decent price. So that was a good example. But for every one that wins, there's probably 2 or 3 that don't as well. So there are no absolutes in this game, which makes it fun and also aggravating at the same time.
Well, and I think that's one of the important points of night school and what we do. Over 40 weeks, we'll probably hit 25 to 30 serious handicapping angles and topics, and not a single one of them is absolute. And so people say, oh, wow, I really learned something about pedigree handicapping. Now I'm handicapping every race as a pedigree handicapper. You know, there are applications to all of this stuff. And like we're talking about, a key race angle may mean absolutely nothing if another horse has a standout advantage. Like Bob's talking about. If there's a horse who's just simply faster than the other horses in the race, I don't care if a horse is coming out of a race with 7 last out winners. If he's not capable of beating the standout horse we're talking about in the example, you're not going to beat him on any kind of angle play. I think like we're talking here, we've got 3 horses, and really, and I think this juvenile is a great example of that, because we really don't know which one of these 3 is the best horse. So what are we going to use to separate American Pharoah, Carpe Diem, and also Daredevil, you know, coming out of the 3 major preps, all winning them equally impressive on different circuits? One of the things that you can look at to try to separate and weigh those 3 will be something like, who did you beat? And like you say, it's not about I beat A and B beat A in this case, because all of these horses have not run against common opponents, you know? So it's kind of trying to get a feel for the opponents that they have beaten and using that as one of the separators. I think a lot of handicapping angles are separators, and very few of them are decisive, I'm going all in type maneuvers. There are very few angles I can think of where I just say, it's this, so therefore I'm playing.
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the work you've done at the night school, and I know that you bring different topics to the table, and you have people that talk about the success they've had using a variety of angles. And that, again, is there's more than one way to skin a cat. Andy Sterling may have one method. John White may have another. Steve Bick has a third. Jeremy Plonk has a fourth. Go right down the line. Bob Neumeier has a fifth. Mike Battaglia has a sixth. I mean, go right down the line. And what's important to me might not be important to Steve Bick. What's important to Steve Bick might not be important to Andy Sterling. There are trip guys. There are speed figure guys. There are appearance guys. There are, name it. I mean, name the angles. I mean, and every one of them has its place in the game. It's what you're comfortable with and how you think you can maximize the situation. I'm not going to get interested in betting the juvenile. I mean, if Daredevil or something shows up at 5-1 and they bet American Pharoah to 3-5 or something, I'll throw a few bucks on Daredevil because his numbers are just as good as American Pharoah. So that's just one way, but I don't have a great great. Well, this is a lock. This Daredevil. Right. It's just playing the board, is what it is, and it's like playing the stock market. You value a company, and it's underpriced, and you might make a play on it. And I would say probably 70% of my bets are like that. That I see a cluster of horses that run about the same numbers. One horse is 2-1, another horse is 9-1. Where am I going? I'm going to the 9-1. I mean, that just makes sense to me. So that, to me, is why I like the analytical part of it and the speed figure part of it, is because I'll go in and I'll say, these are the 3 or 4 contenders in this race. What's the best price? And go from there. You're wrong more often than you're right, but if you're, if you're dutiful about it, the chances are you can stay afloat.
Well, Bob, in terms of the anticipation for Breeders' Cup, what portion of what we're about to embark on are you looking forward to the most? What confrontation? And, of course, we've had quite an upheaval here the last week, given Wise Dan and Beholder leaving the stage.
Yeah, it's a shame. I would have loved to have seen Wise Dan. He's a favorite of mine. Gutsy and boy knows where that line is. I would have loved to see him going against Tornado in some of these Euros. I think the mile is going to be a fascinating event. I think the draw is going to be very, very important on that mile in the grass. It's going to be a big field, and if Anadine or Tornado get caught out in the 13 or 14, I think anything can happen. I'm fascinated by that race. I think the juvenile and the showdown of Pharoah and Carpe Diem and Pletcher's other bomb is interesting as well. Daredevil, I'm interested in that. Those are 3 right off top, and I'm looking for Hollendorfer's classic horse to destroy that field. That's what I'm looking for.
You shared belief you feel lays over.
Yes. I do.
Well, we started the conversation on a hockey note, and I suppose we should also fold in, of course, that Eddie Olczyk will be joining the broadcast team.
Yeah, I did hockey with Eddie on NBC, and I always welcome Eddie at whatever venue it is, hockey or racing. He has a great enthusiasm for it, no doubt.
Well, we are always enthusiastic when we get an opportunity to meet with Bob Neumeier, NBC Sports. Bob, we'll see you in California in a matter of days, a week plus, and it should be spectacular. And we thank you so much for the visit tonight.
It's always my pleasure, and I look forward to having a terrific Breeders' Cup, and I wish the best of luck to all the horse players that are listening. It's quite a challenge, and be very rewarding if at the end of Saturday you come out with a few bucks in your pocket. It's a good test.
It's always fantastic, and
Okay.
there's always surprises, and Bob will look forward to the coverage on NBC. Bob Neumeier, everybody.